Welcome to the Dive Table. I'm Jay Gardner, and with me is our fourth guest co-host of season 2, someone I'm extremely happy to call a friend and a teammate and an awesome diver. Coming to us all the way from Austin, Texas, Mr. Scott Bauer. Scott, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Jay. And I am incredibly happy to be here too.
Good. I'm glad you're happy to be here because it would suck if we started out with and I'll do it because you asked me to.
Yeah, because we're on a Zoom call and it's like I'm at work,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I
Yeah.
just hit record. Right. Well, and producer Daniel is here as well, which must mean we are recording another episode of the show. Scott, it's been a minute since we've released a new episode. You and I had some technical difficulties the last time we tried to do this and finally sorted out. So I'm excited. The moment is here. The software is working. Everything is in our favor to actually record this episode. And I've been looking forward to it. And one of the reasons I'm really excited about having you on the show for the next 3 episodes is that you bring such a strong skill set to the table, right? To the dive table, literally, but that I don't have, which is underwater photography. You are an incredible, I think it's fair to say, up and coming, if not already, established and up and coming underwater photographer. And I have always appreciated having the photos you took from the dives we take together. And in the back of my head, I'm always beating myself up after dives we take that you're not on, that I didn't take any photos. So I'm glad you're here with us to help us unpack the subject of underwater photography. But before we get rolling too far into this episode and the next 3, why don't you take a minute, just introduce yourself to the audience out there, to our listeners. Who are you? Where are you located? How'd you get into diving? All that fun stuff.
Okay, cool. Well, my name is Scott. I've been shooting underwater really since I started diving, which I know in most cases isn't recommended, but it's never really been with, when I first got into this, it's not like I had a big camera or anything like that. I started with a GoPro and got really fascinated with a few aspects of having, some sort of recording device with me when I was underwater going to these places that I was really excited to go to. Um, but we'll take it a few steps backwards because I think it's important for me to kind of explain what got me into diving and why I chose that path, and also kind of what's kept me into it as well. So way back a long time ago, before I ever started getting into the water, before I ever started diving, I've always been really fascinated with marine life. And I used to grow coral in saltwater tanks. One of my favorite little nerdy hobbies, growing different species of coral. You had to maintain this entire little miniature ecosystem inside the tank. In order just for the coral itself to be happy, you had to have all the snails, all the hermit crabs, different types of starfish. Even you have to have fish because they add a certain element to the water too. That keeps this whole system in check, in balance. And just doing that, you learn about all these different things that live on a coral reef and how all these different parts go together. And it just eventually came to the point where I wanted to see this in real life and not a captive environment. And
Right.
that's why I signed up for that first open water class. And I remember me and one of my friends, right after I signed up for that class, we decided to go to the Florida Keys, and that was my first reef dive.
Nice.
And back then, it's so funny how expensive scuba turns out to be. Because back then, I remember I just immediately splurged on a whole set of gear. Right when I got into it, I went straight into like getting my own wing, my own reg. I bought the wetsuit before I even signed up for the class for some reason. And then
Yep.
I really thought I was going high dollar when I bought a GoPro Hero 4, and I had no
Oof.
idea back then how much like how much money I'd probably be unfortunately spending in the long run on a bigger camera system. But it seems to have all kind of paid off, so when I say paid off means like I think I've just about broken even on money that I've made through photography. I don't think that I've profited in any sort of way, but at least it's somewhat justified it at the end of the day.
You fed
But
yourself a
that's
couple
kind of what got
pizzas.
me started. And there is something about having a GoPro running, especially on those early dives, because I still look at that footage every now and then because it's really kind of interesting. And there's all sorts of things that are happening that you're not able to fully take in. And there's this thing that people say about, how they don't like to shoot, mess with GoPros while they're diving because they want to live in the moment. And I totally understand that. But there's a whole element to it that you're losing through just I don't know, just through the human memory. You start to, the details start to soften up and you start to lose, certain aspects of things that you experience to these dives. And one of my favorite things is I have these huge hard drives over here, just terabytes and terabytes of GoPro footage. And every now and then, I'll open up some of those volumes and start going through dives that I did years ago and notice things that I didn't even remember, seeing that were right in
Mm.
front of me. And I think that's really interesting. But yeah, that's kind of like a nutshell of what got me started and what interest kind of led me into diving. And honestly, the GoPro is what got me started in photography because it eventually just, turned into a bigger and bigger camera system, slowly over time. And it's not like I have the most advanced camera now, but compared to the Hero 4, it's definitely a step forward.
Yeah, I think I had a Hero 4 as well, and it got flooded, and that thing did not recover. It lived in rice for like, I
Yeah.
don't know, a week, 2 weeks, tried everything
And
and
it's
could
funny
not
because
recover.
yeah, those older GoPros, they're not waterproof. Now they're all waterproof without the housing.
Yeah,
I mean, only
yeah,
to
exactly.
10 or 15 feet, but if
Yeah,
it floods, it
yeah,
won't hurt it now.
yeah, and that's cool. The story about the growing coral. I mean, that is a really interesting hobby. My daughter and I, or one of my daughters and I, went into a tropical fish store, and that was their specialty, was kind of the
Yeah.
starter corals and all that. And I could have spent days in there learning about all that stuff. It was so fascinating. So it's interesting that was a pathway for you into wanting to go see it in real life. What got you into the fish tanks? Like, was that something you grew up with, or something like random hobby you got
I've had
introduced
them
to?
growing up. I've had them growing up. I wasn't that interested when I was a kid. I think it's just something about just getting into that interest of marine life. That interest starts to grow and build on itself, and you just want to keep growing. There's something really satisfying about watching. This sounds so weird. It's hard for you to understand unless you're actually growing the coral, but there's something really satisfying about watching it grow. It's no different than a bonsai tree or maybe plants that you have in your garden. It's something that you're putting a labor of love into upkeeping every day. And you start to get really passionate about it as you watch it progress through time. And yeah, just through the process of learning about what it needs and how to make it healthier and how to make your whole system that you have set up run more efficiently. Um, it's interest on top of interest that kind of build up each other, if that makes sense.
Okay, but the important question here is, did you name each of your coral? I could imagine you being in the room, being like, "Oh, Carl, Carl, come on,
No, you
Carl."
get really scientific about it. It's the opposite, and I think a lot of people that are really into growing coral or raising fish. There's a lot of fish breeders that are really scientific about it. They're actually kind of against naming them, because it's more about the species type and everything along those lines. Whereas like maybe when you're a kid and you had an aquarium, you would name your fish, but this is more of the I don't know. There's something kind of funny about that, but this is more about the science to it, I guess.
Okay, all right, good. I was curious. I think I would have named the coral. I don't know why, but it's awesome. And you're in Austin. Are you
Yeah,
originally from there, or where are you from? How'd you end up where you are?
I'm originally from New Orleans, and I was actually born in Houston. Grew up in New Orleans. Spent high school back in the Houston area, and then spent college in Lubbock, Texas, at Texas Tech,
Okay,
and came
okay,
to Austin after
and
that.
then Austin after that. Okay, good.
Hmm.
So, and you and I have dove a ton together, which is fun. And now I'm in California, and you're still in Texas. So
Yeah,
we'll probably get the chance to bring up the old dives and all that fun stuff too. But there's a lot to see in Texas as well. Not coral, unless you're out in the Gulf there. But that's good. So for our episodes together, I think that we wanted to stay kind of in the ballpark of photography. there's a ton of divers out there who want to be able to capture their experience under the water, kind of like what you'd say. Capture those memories, have them forever in hard drives and things. And because of that, they've taken up some level of underwater photography. And so for this particular episode, we wanted to kind of go back to the roots and ask maybe the fundamental question about underwater photography to start us, which is why take photos underwater in the first place? Like, why even is it worth it? Like, what's the deal here? And I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. So, are you ready to jump into this first episode?
Yeah.
Pause there. You're supposed to have a catchy catchphrase like "Let's go coral."
Oh yeah.
Whatever you want to say. I'm kidding. I'm kiddting.
I guess
Daniel, an edit
I
at
guess you
10.
could say I'm ready to camera roll right in.
There you go. There you go. Let me write that down. 10:58. 10:56. Okay. Trying to help Daniel with editing. We'll pick it back up at, we'll call it 11:20. Okay. Let's do this first. All right, good. So let's run into this. Let's jump into this subject on photography. So I think the place to start to set all this up is to start with what are right now the various underwater photography options that are out there for people. So what are the types of photography people can focus on? What are the tools that are available? And kind of what's the scope of taking photos? I mean, are you dive planning for photos or dive sites, dedicated to that's photos? Or, is it more I'm diving, having fun, and then I take a photo here and there, kind of the whole thing. So let's get into maybe first, what are the types of photography that you see people kind of broadly jumping into and getting into at this point?
Yeah, well, on the surface level, I guess you can start with the idea of carrying a GoPro with you. And that's usually where most people start. And usually in that use case, you're not planning a dive to take a photo or a video. It's something that you have hanging from your D ring or whatever, that you can pull out quickly and capture, whatever's swimming by. And at that rate, it's there's not too much involved with it. It's super easy. You can upload it to your phone and post it to Facebook or whatever almost immediately. And that's usually where most people that get into it get started, in my opinion. I could be totally wrong about that, but GoPros are now they're great for video, not so much for stills. But I would say if you're shooting wide angle, it's definitely better than what you would get from like those Olympus TG6 or whatever those things are that you see everybody have. But on the other hand, if you're shooting tiny creatures, the Olympus cameras that they do amazing, and a GoPro does terrible for that. So it just kind of depends on what's happening, but different types of photography, can be separated into two different categories really broadly, and that's going to be anything that's wide angle and then anything that's macro. And macro is of course a tiny seahorse or a shrimp or something small, and wide angle is you're capturing the entire scene of something. And yeah, so really those two broad categories, that's what you're going to get.
And then within those categories, probably it starts to subdivide into subjects. So there might be
Mhm.
people that are really, passionate about taking photos of mammals under the water, or people, I know there's a whole like Facebook group and a group of people that are like nudie branch. That's what like their
Yeah,
thing is,
yeah.
and it's like that's their for you it might be, getting that
Or
picture of
people,
the
or
gar,
or
right?
people
Or
shooting
people,
people
right?
underwater. There's a whole thing for mermaids. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
there's
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
there's even a Netflix show about it right now, which is
Is there
kind of
really?
funny.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I know two of those mermaids that are on that show. They've come down to San Marcos, and we've done we've done photo shoots.
That's crazy. And there's also product. I mean, I think it's more of a niche in terms of product photography underwater, but I've been seeing a little bit of like the stylistic, like advertising photography,
Mhm.
people getting into a little bit that's kind of interesting. But there is a lot of that for underwater products as well, like lights and scuba gear in a lot of ways needs
It's
photographs as
interesting that
well.
you say that. Yeah, because so Under the Jungle, when I went and dove there, and of course you're familiar with them.
Sure.
I don't really want to drop any names, but the uh, the the guide that I had, she said that her boyfriend, that's part of how he makes his living, is doing product photography. I guess in the cenotes out there in that beautiful clear water, whether it's some sort of dress watch or anything like that that you can set in a nice little backdrop and have some light rays and
Yeah, yeah. No, I've
however
seen
that all
coffee,
comes together. Yeah.
like a bag of coffee and a coffee
Yeah,
mug. I don't know
yeah.
if there's actually
Sounds kind of
coffee in
fun
it,
though.
probably full of rocks, but
Yeah.
still, it was a bag of coffee. I've seen different things, kind of interesting. Cracking the rum, that should definitely be a
Oh,
group
that's a
that's
good
trying, or
idea.
a company that's trying to take some
I need to
photos under the
sneak a
water.
bottle of that into Spring Lake one day and get some shots.
Yeah, yeah, there you go. See, yeah. So I think you're right. There's kind of this wide angle capturing a whole scene, kind of maybe to when you're talking about the GoPro, just kind of I've seen things that, put it on your mask or just kind of hit record and go and don't think about it afterwards, and that might be more like documentarian style, you know, photography in that way. It's really videography at that point,
Mhm.
versus the macro, which is I think a lot of folks, that see people on dive boats going out with big rigs. Usually, it's the macro cameras. I think. I mean, you tell me because I don't really know, but I would assume when I see those photographers underwater, they're seeing things that I'm not seeing, along a wall or in a coral reef or something like that, and so they're trying to get that perfect picture of that crab or that little octopus or whatever it would be that they're
Mhm.
seeing. I've also seen some folks, and this is photography, for with the underwater phone cases, which I don't think I'd ever trust a case with my phone, but I saw some people messing with it on a dive boat, trying to figure out how to make sure it was watertight. I think they ended up not bringing in the water, which I could totally understand because
Yeah.
that's a big risk, right? Like you're going to 40
Yeah.
feet and that thing
That's the
floods. Like, look,
thing.
it's expensive.
How many
But I've
GoPros have
seen
I
that as well.
found on the bottom? How many GoPros have I found on the bottom of Canyon Lake? And and if you think about it, if you lose your GoPro, not a whole lot, once you're done with your dive, yeah, that sucks that you lost your GoPro, but at least you can call people and function in society. Um,
Right.
if you drop your phone and ends up on the bottom of Canyon Lake and you can't find it, then I mean, losing your phone's a painful thing to go through, and that does kind
Yes.
of suck. But that is the new thing, those housings made by, I think the company's called Divolk. They're really well made and they're really reliable. And of course, the camera technology in all these new iPhones is progressing pretty quick, and it's definitely nothing like what you get from a real camera system, but it's still pretty impressive, and it certainly beats what you can get with a GoPro. And honestly, that's the way to go these days. I think instead of buying a GoPro is getting that, and you can shoot macro with it. You can shoot wide angle video. It's fully stabilized. I mean, it looks great on the newer iPhones.
Yeah.
But if
Yeah.
you
I mean,
lose it,
it's a,
you're losing a
yeah,
lot.
exactly. Exactly. I mean, if you happen to be in the financial situation where you can buy another iPhone just to
Yeah.
take diving, then like it sounds like a good platform. But yeah, there's a lot you're risking if something goes wrong or you lose it, or how many things have you left on a dive boat? You know what I mean? You forget anything
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
kit. But yeah, and then okay, so there's the underwater phone case. There's the GoPro, which look, I'm a big GoPro user, but I usually am only utilizing that tool when I'm teaching. So
Hmm.
I've put together a few, GoPro videos from various trips I've taken and things like that. And I have to admit, it's one of those things that I'm not great at, nor do I love putting all the energy into that yet. Like I'm trying to love it. I want to love it because I want to share what I've been up to. But at the same time, like it's a lot of work and I haven't gone back to doing it again, and I regret that. So those are kind of the maybe more amateur approaches. What starts to happen when you go, okay, I want to get more serious than what I can get with my GoPro? What kinds of rigs do you kind of see out there now?
Yeah. Well, no, that's a good question. I think it starts when you love the process of just editing your GoPro footage from the dive that day. If that's something that you're not feeling, then it's probably never going to happen.
Oh yeah, I'm
There's just
sunk.
no for real though. Like I think there's certain personality types that sort of thing works for, and certain personality types that that type of creation just they have no interest in that. There's just something fun for me about going on a dive and then bringing back that footage and being able to share it with people to where other people see it as a chore. But yeah, if you make it past that stage and you realize that is something that you want to do, I would say the next stage after that is to get into maybe like a lower end Sony mirrorless camera, or one of those Canon mirrorless cameras. A lot of people make the mistake of going with like I always forget if it's a TG4 or TG6. I haven't even looked into it any deeper than that. A lot of people make that mistake though, and what you're getting with that camera, again, it takes really good stills macro, but you're not going to be able to shoot very good wide images with it. And I think that's why a lot of people lose interest so quick, because they take that camera that costs them a lot of money, and they take it on a dive with them, and they shoot a wide, like a wide shot. They get back, and this is like blue, washed out looking image that probably looks worse than what a GoPro could give you. And you're like, why did I go through the trouble of carrying this thing with me? And you have no interest in it after that point. And you kind of, put it on the shelf and move on. Um, but there's a lot to be gained from a lower end, very affordable but good quality camera system like what Sony and Canon both have to offer on their lines of mirrorless cameras, and you can do a lot with those even without good lighting. There's quite a bit you could do if you know how to edit it, and that's the whole other pitfall that you got to kind of get past too. Is 90% of a good underwater photo, in my opinion, is editing, or not
Yeah,
90%, but a lot of it. And yeah, if you're just gonna pull it straight out of camera, it's always gonna look blue and washed out.
yeah, yeah. So you've got the camera, whether you're going mirrorless or not. You got the housing, which is a whole different ball game. Well, I should say you have camera and then lenses, and then you
Yeah, the
have
lenses.
housings,
There's a lot
and
of
then you have, when you really get into it, lighting and all that stuff is not cheap by any means, just like any photography, but anything that goes underwater is a little more expensive. So I mean, you can, like you're saying, you can start with one of those mirrorless Sonys or Canons and a housing. Obviously, like, don't just take the camera you buy at Best Buy and go diving with it. You have to put it in a housing. But then
yeah,
eventually you're going to upgrade the housing, and you're going to upgrade to lights and strobe versus this, and then eventually you get into the stuff that kind of you're doing and other pros are doing, where you're even like placing lights in an environment before you even take the shot, right? Like, which is crazy. So yeah, it kind of scales, and I'm sure it goes even further than that, as you go up the scale there. But yeah, it kind of scales up from the underwater Apple camera to this humongous rig, that's as big as your wing, that you can get into
yeah.
the water.
Causes more drag than your entire dive kit. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly.
that's funny. All right, well, good. So I think that kind of covers the types. So again, wide angle versus macro, and subject dependent, and some of the tools that are readily available, obviously, to the average, maybe up and coming photographer. When we talk about the pros, the not geo, photographers, is a whole nother layer of things, I think, that get added to it. But I think that kind of covers that. So let's maybe talk about, there's gear, there's the subject, there's wide angle versus macro, but like, why and you kind of alluded to it, I think, in the beginning here, but why do underwater photos matter kind of in the grand scheme of things? So, there is that argument out there that, look, like, I'm diving and I want to be in the moment. And there's some truth to that for me, even with, like, Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. I've talked about before on this podcast about, removing the frame and being a part of the environment and having that experience versus seeing it through a lens or seeing it through a camera, or even reliving it, later through a hard drive, like you're talking about your first dives.
Hmm.
So why do underwater photos kind of matter in the grand scheme of things? And is there a personal payoff to capturing a photo or a set of photos? And I think you alluded to some of this stuff in the opening, but I want to unpack that a little bit more.
Okay, yeah, and I think, like, for me, there's definitely a personal payoff to it, and it's part of it is sharing it with other people, but part of it is very personal too. You know, the whole whatever that is, that drive that makes us all want to go scuba diving all the time. Because there's some people that dive a few times a year, and then there's people like us that are obsessed with it for some reason, and there's something that draws us to that. And when you get into photography, you typically will start photographing things that you love, like that. And there is something about trying to capture, just like what you said. You're talking about living in the moment and removing the frame. There's something about putting a frame up there and trying to capture certain can't even talk, specific things within that frame, that kind of capture everything that you want to take and share with somebody else, and convey what you love about that specific thing. And
Yeah, that makes
I would
sense.
say too that there's another thing too about when you're somewhere that you find really fascinating, in a place that you feel like is very cool. Like, for example, the first time I ever went to the Flower Garden banks, I was blown away. I haven't been diving in a whole lot of places by that point. And that was one of the earlier coral reefs that I've ever seen. And I was just blown away. There's something about wanting to capture that moment and kind of freeze that moment in the best way that you possibly can, so you could bring that back home and either turn it into a fine art print or share it with your friends, or even just post it on social media, whatever you're into. It's kind of like a souvenir to where you're not really taking anything from that place.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And like I said, I think that's some of the regret I have sometimes, is like, oh, I wish there's only so far that verbal storytelling can go, to where you're trying to communicate what you saw, or
Hmm.
friends that don't dive, or what it's like under the water. and
Yeah,
and it's hard to convey that in with words often. And
and that's
sometimes I
what it
think
is. In
too
my
it's
opinion,
hard.
it's a form of communication. I think that's a very good way to put it, and that's what photography is on any level. You're telling a story with one image, whereas a video, you're
Mhm.
telling a story in multiple sequences. Photography is, you're trying to include whatever you need in that one image to tell that story. And if your audience is people that don't dive, and you're trying to share with them that amazing feeling that you got the first time you dove in the Flower Garden banks in the Gulf of Mexico, and you want them to feel that grandness that you felt when you first jumped in there. That's a really special thing. If I'm ever able to accomplish that, that would feel really good. If you could just
Yeah.
nail it, just like absolutely nail it in one photograph, and it just kind of hangs there for forever and keeps getting shared and looked at, and just builds its own life.
Yeah, it's like the light rays in the pit. You see
Yeah,
that
yeah,
picture.
yeah,
There's
yeah.
there's one of those pictures that we don't even. I don't even probably have to say which one it is. We both have probably the same image in our head right now of that picture
There's a picture
with
I
the
keep
rays.
seeing of Ponderosa too. That's kind of like that, and
Yeah,
it's just
and
these God rays coming through the opening. And
and it did kind of capture what that felt like when you dove there. We didn't dive there together. We dove there separately, but when you dove there, that image is what comes to mind from that experience. Even though there's a lot more to both of those sites, the
And I've
pictures
never
that get
been to
you to the
Ponderosa. I'm
rooms and
talking
all
about
that.
somebody else's. I'm talking about somebody else's
Oh,
photos
okay,
that I
okay.
keep seeing. Yeah, I've never been to Ponderosa. I want to. I've been told to go there in the wintertime. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah, El Pit. I mean, that blew my mind for sure. I
yeah,
really loved that experience.
yeah,
But I think
yeah.
there's something else that you said earlier. I didn't mean to cut you off, Jay. My bad. But
No,
there's
go ahead,
something
go
else that
ahead.
you said. There's something else you said earlier too, that kind of answers your question in a way, because you were talking about the different levels that a photographer might be on, whether they're just carrying a GoPro to shoot from the hip as they're diving, or whether they're going as far as to plan an entire dive to take a shot. And that's another thing that I've always found really fascinating, and I haven't really gotten into it at that level yet, but I definitely, want to grow to that, because that's when you're planning a dive, kind of like a mission, to where, you're coming back with this image that you have in your mind, this thing that you want to create. And now you're taking this whole tangible skill that you've been learning, and all these technical things, and then you're mixing it with creativity in its own way. I just find that really fascinating, and then you get to come back with that package, basically.
Yeah,
And that's something that I really like the idea of that.
yeah. I mean, you're going as far as storyboarding out the
Hmm.
communication that you want to have, right? And trying to go and capture those images. I mean, as an instructor, that's a normal thing to do in terms of planning out dives for specific purposes, right? So we're going to
Yeah.
accomplish this on this dive. But I think that is a layer of photography where you're planning out the dive, and I think that that's a big scope. It's not just the storyboard and things that you need to capture, because you're in the wild. There's no guarantee. All right, we need,
Anything can
I
happen.
always
Yeah.
joke about the that cartoon I saw, the Find a Fish book, the diver shooting an SMB into a jellyfish. Like, if that's on your storyboard, like, I need the shot of the diver shooting the SMB into the center of a jellyfish.
And I
Like,
need three
there's a
dolphins
lot
in the
of
background.
dependencies. And dolphins in the background with a great white fin on the top. Like, okay, like, there's no guarantee. But even if you're getting in the water to say, like, oh, we really want to capture, like, I always think about Spring Lake and the gar, and the gar bar. There's a location in Spring Lake, or in the spring there, that is known as, or nicknamed as, the gar bar, because that's where the gars are supposed to hang out, and they're somewhat elusive, right? They're not exactly the most easy subjects to photograph. And you and I have been in there multiple times together, and I remember the dive that we went on, and you go, like, I got it, I got the gar, like, you were there, like, it was awesome. I'm like, I was wondering what the heck you were chasing up on the surface, and, like, yeah, or you weren't on the surface, but close to, like, way
Close to
up
the
there,
top.
and I'm
Yeah,
like,
nobody. Usually, people that go with me, they don't see the gar. For those of you that don't know, Alex, he dives with us a lot, and I'll do a lot of Spring Lake dives with him. And he has told me that he thinks those gar are CGI, because every time I go on a dive with him and photograph them, he doesn't see them on the dive whatsoever. But it's
right.
kind of funny. You're right, because you have to go kind of up on the top towards the surface, and you're behind like some brush, some foliage that's back there. And if you're down on the riverbed, you won't see them.
Yeah, and when you think about the intention, or the intentionality behind shooting like that, and you ask that question, why do underwater photos matter in the grand scheme of things? I also think, if you zoom out and you think about, like, the story of Valerie Taylor, for example. I don't know if you saw a documentary, Playing with Sharks, but it was great. But a lot of these stories, Valerie Taylor, Jacques Cousteau, obviously the most famous one, the inventor of the aqualung, all these things, even Dr. Sylvia Earle at some level. A lot of these stories started with, fishing. I was a underwater spearfisher, and then I started taking underwater photographs and video, and then I realized, oh, this video tells a story, and so I started telling that story, and then I realized the things that we do actually affect the underwater world, and it turned into some of the great conservationists of their time. And so when you think about, like, the percentage of people that are privileged enough to call themselves scuba divers and have been able to see what a coral reef looks like for themselves, or what excuse me, what a spring or cenote looks like, or what, the wall in an ocean looks like, or a wreck. There aren't it's not a mass. It's not like, how many people have flown on an airplane at this point. It's a lot. How many people have seen a coral reef with their own eyes under the water? The number is limited. But then you say, how many people know what a coral reef is? And almost everybody would. And why? Because those photos bring it to life. Well, what's happening in the ocean, what's happening over time at a dive site or in a particular environment. And so I think that photos matter in the grand scheme of things because they bring others into that world, into that environment, into that wild that otherwise either couldn't or won't ever be in that environment. And that has turned into a lot of conservation and activism, and that's amazing. So there's something special too about, I think, about the separation between photographs and videography. I don't know why, but videography feels more, at least this is how people have described it to me when I was asking them about it, was feels more that you're observing something. It's harder to put yourself in that environment. You're more observing what somebody else is
Mhm.
doing versus a photograph, for whatever reason, because it's limited, because it's, only the four, sides of that frame, feels like you can put yourself in that scene easier. Like your imagination has an easier job putting yourself in it for some reason than it does with watching a video. And I found that kind of interesting. And as I thought about it, true. So anyway, my point being that I think that underwater photography has a huge role to play when it's used in that way to introduce people to what's happening under our water, what's happening in our waterways, and leads to, I'm not saying all photographs lead to conservationism and activism, but that certainly has been a pathway for people. And that's, I think, a really, kudos to photography and those that get really into it to tell those stories and show, you know, even if it's your small group of friends that don't dive, what you see, it's a cool way to invite them into that environment that needs us to be conscious of our underwater, health and underwater, um, ways that we impact.
No, I think that's very real. Yeah, even if it's in like such a small way of one or two of your friends seeing it, and I think a lot of that too. The local Texas stuff, because a lot of people don't realize that there's springs in the hill country that look like Spring Lake or Land Lake in New Braunfels, and it's always interesting to me when you post a picture of one of those areas and people ask you where you went on vacation to go take that picture or something like that. It's like, well,
Right.
that blue water's, right here. There's springs all over the place in the hill country, and a lot of people don't realize that. And I think that's another fascinating thing about the flower garden banks too, because a lot of people don't realize there's a coral reef off the coast of Galveston. Because the last thing when you go and look at that chocolate milk water on the beach of Galveston, the last thing you expect to be, even if it is 100 miles offshore, the last thing you would expect to be out there is that. And I've always found that kind of funny too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, good. I mean, I think there is both a personal payoff to photography and a broader impact that photographs can bring and videography can bring. Of course, like I'm going back to feeling like I didn't love editing my GoPro videos, so I'm hopeless. But
And it's fine if you didn't love it. Yeah, it's just I think that type of activity only works with certain personalities. I think only certain types of people can ever be into that, and it's definitely something you can't really force yourself to like. And I totally understand if you don't.
yeah, it's one of those things in the back of my head that I always think about is like if I just got better at sharing what I'm doing, and having
Mhm.
that muscle in your repertoire, and I just never have it. But at the same time, I so appreciate, like, for example, I mean, this is a stupid appreciation, but it's still an appreciation. We just moved, everyone knows that, out in the podcast world, and I have a new house to furnish and an office and things. And yeah, I'm like, hey Scott, can I print a couple pictures that you took of me under the water? Is that cool with you? And like, yeah, you're like, hey, yeah, no worries. Like, send me which ones. I'll send you the high res photo, and I'm going to put those up in my office. And they're memories. You know, the ones that I wanted. One was on that little expedition we took out in the river there.
Oh yeah,
You know,
yeah,
that
the
was a great
Frio.
photo. And the other one was, you know, I think we are actually in Spring Lake, and I was just messing around. I was being a, you know, photographer, dive buddy, dive teammate, and sitting there watching whatever you were doing and making sure you were good, and not seeing what you were seeing, but happy to be there and in support of you. And then when you finally turned around, I was just messing around. I'm like, hey, you know, look at, I'm going to be an underwater magician, like, you know, like threw smoke up in the air,
I
and
know what
you
photo you're
captured
talking
that
about now.
moment.
Yeah,
Yeah, kind of
that's
funny.
funny.
So I'm like, I want those.
Down in
They're
cream of wheat.
moments. They're cool. Yeah, the cream wheat. Yeah, cream wheat one.
Yeah,
So, well, good. All right. Well, obviously, we're not going to solve world peace here in the podcast,
yeah.
but
I'm definitely not going to. But other photographers will, and I totally get what you're saying on that, and I completely agree. Um, but yeah, no, it can happen in a small way too, I think, and that's kind of fun.
yeah, and I think too, it's cool that in some ways that skill set for you, at least, like you said, you've kind of broken even. So it's become a side hustle, and then it's become a focus for you to build, which is really
Yeah, and it's
cool
not
as
like I
well.
did it for the money either, you know? Like if I look back and think about how much fun I had doing all that stuff that I've done, you know, with just diving in general and photography in general. And the fact that I mean I would pay a ton of money to do a lot of that stuff, you know, so I'm good to be honest.
You're good.
I
You're
just want
good in the
to, yeah,
balance
I
things.
just want to keep on, you know, finding some interesting places to go and try to take a good photograph or two.
Yes, and you know, just don't ever hire an accountant to like actually balance the books.
Yeah, yeah,
That's what scares
exactly.
me about scuba. You know, like no,
Yeah.
you that knowledge would not be power. That knowledge would be, you know, I think a sad day.
Yeah, I know. It
You
blows
look at
my
it.
mind like how quickly stuff adds up to and things that you don't even and things that you don't even want to count. Like for example, I ordered some parts kits today for my regulators and then I was looking at how much I've been spending on gas fills and you don't even think about that sort of thing. You like to think about the bigger stuff. Like, how much did I spend on buying those tanks, buying that wing, buying the regs, and you don't take it you don't take into account usually what you're spending on just maintenance or
Right.
the gas itself.
Yeah. 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 Totally. All right. Well, maybe let's wrap this one up with some advice. So for you, my advice is really simple for you know, to answer this question. I don't know, you know, like 'cause I'm not in your realm by any means, but what advice do you have for divers that are maybe getting into photography or thinking about like that enjoyed editing that GoPro video and sharing it out? You know, what
Mhm.
advice do you have for those people that are kind of interested in going down that path?
Yeah, there's two things. The first and most important thing is to work on buoyancy and trim and be able to control the directions that you're going to go, be able to go, most importantly, be able to go backwards. If you can back kick, I know that, you know, in most I guess for most technical divers, back kicking is kind of like a secondary thing, not that big of a deal. But for a photographer, the fact that you can back up when you accidentally push yourself too close to the subject, that's the most useful thing ever. And you know, it's something that um, I used to be really bad at, and I recently worked on it. But it's been a game changer, you know, learning how to back kick. But yeah, that goes into the whole buoyancy and trim thing. If you can figure out what it means to have good form as a diver in whatever organization or agency you choose to get your training from. And on the gear side of things, avoid any sort of point and shoot camera. Once you decide to move past a GoPro or a cell phone, I would look into. I mean, there's a lot of really inexpensive plastic composite housings now that are plenty reliable. So I would look into finding one of those that fits on some sort of low end Sony or Canon mirrorless camera. If yeah, so let me kind of rewind a little bit. Find the housing first. Make sure that it's a camera that you want, and then get the camera. Don't get the camera and expect to find a housing.
Ah, that's a good one. Why is that? Because it's hard to find the right
Most
housing.
people buy a camera and say, "I want to take this underwater." Like my friend, for example, he bought a Panasonic GH5 Mark II. I think is it GH5? Yeah, GH5. Really expensive camera, really nice camera, and yeah, you can find an underwater housing for it, but it's going to be made by Nauticam, and it's going to cost you $6,000. But his idea was to put inside a Sea Frogs housing, which is an amazing idea. And Sea Frogs makes housings for those, but not for the Mark II. So he bought that camera and wasn't really ever able to take it underwater, and it was a huge investment for him. And he recently sold it. But I think about things like that. So get the housing, then buy the camera that goes in that housing is what I would
Yeah,
suggest.
yeah, that's a really good.
So if you get on
Something
Sea
I would have
Frogs or any
never
of those
known.
websites, you find an affordable housing for it, then that's probably the best way to go.
Yeah, within the budget, unless you're
Mhm.
independently wealthy, then go for it.
Yeah, yeah. Unless you have the money
Knock
for one of
yourself out.
those. Yeah, exactly. Unless you have the money for one of those pro quality underwater housings, then I would look at the camera first. Then, but if you're on a budget, get the budget housing first.
And if you're listening to this and you are in that position, Scott, you can reach Scott at Scott Bauer, at gmail.com, whatever, and just buy two and send him one. He'd appreciate it. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's good advice. It's interesting though that you started with the personal skills, because you kind of took the words right out of my mouth on that. Is that the only thing I know, or that I've observed, I should say, is that I've seen a lot of frustrated photographers, let's say, people that are maybe up and coming in photography, um, or trying to learn it. They get really frustrated. Oh, I didn't get that picture, or they start comparing those pictures, and it's not, it's because they couldn't stop, right? They got too close and they didn't know how to go backwards, right? Or they crashed into the reef because their buoyancy was bad, or they started focusing on something and their buoyancy goes, they lose it and go up or down. And I think that's not only a really important point that you made, but it's also a safety point. Like, I think if you're not somewhat comfortable, that's the word I've been using, I think, in season 2 that keeps coming through, is being comfortable in your skills, like getting to where you want to be. I want to be over there and then I want to stop. Are you comfortable doing that, right? Without crashing into something or grabbing something? Are you comfortable, focusing on things? Because like you said in the beginning of the show, there are things that you go back and look at in that video that you realize, oh, I didn't even see that. And I was in the environment. We have a tendency to have tunnel vision really easily. You think about your first, couple open water dives outside of your open water course, all you're really looking at is your depth gauge and your SPG, right? Constantly. Like, you don't see anything else on the dive because this is new gear. Like, is my gas still on, right? There's a lot of stress around those things. And so you're tunneled into that piece of equipment. When you start to add in something like a camera that requires like settings, that requires framing, that requires, all of these sorts of things, it's not just a point and shoot unless you're doing, a GoPro in some ways. But if you're trying to capture a shot, it's it can be dangerous if you're not already comfortable with your personal skill
Mhm.
set under the water to then add that in, because now you're tunnel visioned into the camera and maybe you're forgetting completely to focus on checking your gas, because you don't do that normally, right? Or that's probably the extreme version, but there are lighter versions where you're checking the settings of your camera and all of a sudden you're on the surface, which I've seen lots of
Yeah,
times,
yeah,
or you're crashing into the bottom. So I think that skill set, and then you don't get the photo and your dive's over, like, or you put yourself into an emergency situation. So, so I think it's good advice. Like, I don't know I wouldn't venture as far as to say on a podcast what I think what level those skills should be at. But I think the word comfortable, if you
hmm
are not yet comfortable with just your diving apparatus as it is, um, adding the camera to some degree is going to add another piece of gear that's going to, take your situational awareness inward rather than outward into the environment. And you have to be careful with that. So I think that's really good advice, getting squared away. And I also think, maybe to add on to that, and this is maybe me being safety officer, Jay here, but I think too, when you're adding new gear, even if you are comfortable, like for example, I went on a dive with brand new, like 7 brand new things, which is not smart, right? There was no way I should bring a camera on that dive, even a GoPro, right? Because I have so many new things, like new undergarment, new dry suit, new this. And it's like, okay, I have so many things just to get comfortable in.
Hmm.
And I need to focus on those things while maintaining my safety. So again, if you're adding a piece of gear, add it progressively, right? If you're changing something in your kit, maybe don't take the camera on that dive while you're dialing
Yeah.
that in, right?
And I
So
do that
so
even, like, when I go on vacation and go on, like, a long dive trip, I'll even a lot of times the first dive of that trip, I don't bring the camera, just to kinda get dialed in and get used to everything, and it's not even just being comfortable with diving. I think, like, if you're gonna be operating a like a camera that actually allows you to control the f-stop and the shutter speed and ISO and whatnot, if you're focusing on that, the amount of task loading that adds into what you're doing, diving needs to be second nature. It needs to be something that, kinda like riding a bicycle, you're able to stay buoyant without even thinking about it. And I'm not talking about using GoPros or, point and shoot type stuff. At that point, it's not a not as big of a deal. But if you're using like a camera, diving should definitely be second nature by that point. You should have a good amount of dives under your belt, before you try to take that on. Because you're not only risking your own safety, but you're also risking losing an incredibly expensive piece of equipment that you probably spent a lot of money on, or putting yourself or someone else in danger. And you're not really going to be able to focus on getting getting any good work until that aspect, of what you're doing is pretty well under your own control.
yeah, maybe we'll unpack more of this in the next episode. I think this is a good subject because it's interesting that the first place you went with, how to get started is personal skills, and then I would add to that then team skills,
Mhm.
and then technical skills on the photography. So maybe we'll unpack some of that in the next episode.
Yeah,
Sound good?
yeah, absolutely.
All right, good. All right, well, let's wrap this one up. I mean, this has been good. It's funny. This is so easy. We've spent hours. We took a trip. It was like 4 hours out and 4 hours back in the truck in one day. I think it was something like that, 3 hours, something like that. And I was laughing. I compare that trip because you and I just endlessly talked for the whole time there and the whole
It
way
was like
back.
our own podcast, yeah.
Yeah, it was like doing a podcast, and just about diving. It wasn't like just it was talking about diving. So it was funny because this felt like that. Super simple. I looked down at the clock. Go, oh wow, we're at time. It's time to wrap this one up. So Scott, thank you so much. Before we go, would you let people know where they can find you if they want to connect with you or see some of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a YouTube channel. It's Scott Bauer Below, and then my Instagram is also Scott Bauer Below. That's where you could go to see a lot of my photos that I post, and all of my video is going to be on the YouTube channel. So yeah, feel free to check out either of those. And my last name is Bauer.
Yeah, like the TV show, right?
Yeah, or Eddie Bauer.
Yeah.
Either way, yeah.
Or Eddie. Oh, Eddie Bauer. Yeah. No, there's only one
Or
Bauer,
Bauer
and it's
Skates.
Jack.
I think there's Bauer
No,
Skates.
it's Jack. I'm sorry. It's Jack Bauer. Yeah. 24. Oh my gosh. That was, what's so funny about that is, so I never really got into it live TV. I never was like a get around the TV at a certain time person. And even now, like I think the only time I've ever done that for any show was Game of Thrones when that one was around. It was like a whole
Yeah.
community event. But I remember this maybe dates me, but I remember 24 when I was in college. I had a house with like I don't know 5 or 6 roommates. You know how it goes in college, and we had a real house though. One of those college roommates had the like check out 4 discs at a time from Blockbuster deal. Like he paid for that monthly subscription or whatever, and so like the whole house benefited from that. And I remember at one point he brought home or someone brought home the first 4 discs of 24, season 1. And oh yeah, okay, fine, I'll watch it. And it was just like going back and forth to Blockbuster, every
Yeah.
week and exchanging 4 discs for this and 4 discs for that
I always
to
thought that
get,
show was
to
funny
watch
because
Jack
so
Bauer.
much happens in 24 hours in that show. It's like suddenly he's in Paris after he was in New York 4 hours ago, you know?
He never eats. He never
Yeah, never
sleeps.
eats.
He never
Yeah, there's
goes to the
never anything like
bathroom.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's never a dull moment in Jack Bauer's life. So that's why I said there's only one. Anyway, okay, good. So Scott Bauer below on YouTube and at Scott Bauer below on Instagram. Connect. You might even see the photos I was referring to earlier of me on his Insta, and check it
Yeah,
out.
they're
So
there.
they're there somewhere, I'm sure. Yeah. So good. Well, today we focused on why, kind of the fundamental question: why take photos underwater in the first place? And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Are you an aspiring underwater photographer? How do you feel about taking photos underwater? How did you get your start, or what phase are you in? Are you still in the GoPro phase where you hate editing the video like me, or are you well beyond it, building your own rigs and things and getting paid to take photos? We'd love to hear from you. So reach out to Scott or myself. We'd love to hear your comments. And make sure that you subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be Spotify or Apple or wherever you get them, so you can be a part of this growing community. Any parting thoughts, Scott?
Um, Man, putting me on the spot. I would say no, I don't have any parting thoughts.
No parting thoughts.
Yeah,
Just
we're gonna have to edit that part out.
part the subject away from the background, right? That's a parting
Mhm.
thought. I don't have any good photography jokes. Sorry, I don't know. Don't be a part of taking bad photos underwater. There you go. A
There you
parting
go.
thought.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'll go with that.
There you go. All right, awesome. Well, thanks out there for joining us today, and we look forward to having you back on the next episode of The Dive Table.